Neville Goddard's central claim in this title is not about outward behavior, confidence, or dramatic assertion. It is about an inner cognitive position. To act as if the decision is final means that, in his framework, the mind no longer treats an outcome as pending, negotiable, or dependent on future confirmation. The decision is considered complete at the level of consciousness before any external sequence appears to reflect it. You are asked to notice the difference between preferring an outcome and concluding one. A preference still contains psychological movement, comparison, checking, and mental revision. A final decision, in Neville's usage, is the cessation of this movement. The mind stops oscillating between alternatives and occupies one position. As settled, Neville describes this not as emotional intensity, but as cognitive closure. Reality, in his model, does not reorganize in response to wanting, but in response to assumed completion. What is decisive is not outward action, but the inner condition in which no further internal vote is being taken. The unresolved tension remains whether the mind can truly adopt such finality before circumstances provide justification for this model to operate. A foundational assumption must be in place that consciousness is prior to experience, not a byproduct of it. Neville treats awareness as the initiating condition rather than the final receiver of events. You are invited to observe how, in ordinary reasoning, certainty is granted by circumstances. Something happens, and then the mind allows itself to conclude. In Neville's framework, this order is reversed. The conclusion is internally reached first, and experience later appears in alignment with it. A decision is therefore not causative because it is reasonable or supported, but because it is internally settled. External conditions are interpreted as secondary expressions of a stance already taken within consciousness. The psychological question is whether one can experience oneself as the source of certainty rather than as its dependent. The model only remains coherent if inner position is allowed to precede and organize outer registration. Neville's system relies on a specific mental operation: assumption. An assumption is not a verbal statement and not an emotion produced for its own sake. It is the acceptance of a condition as already resolved. You are asked to notice how thoughts normally behave when something is undecided. The mind rehearses alternatives, anticipates objections, and checks for feedback. When a conclusion is reached, this activity quiets. Attention stabilizes. The matter is no longer internally open. Feeling, in Neville's technical sense, refers to this state of settledness. It is the absence of inner contradiction. When a decision becomes final in this way, it functions as a reference point for expectation and interpretation. The mind no longer asks whether the outcome will occur. It proceeds as if the question has already been answered. The issue is whether such closure can be maintained without sensory confirmation. Neville places emphasis on attentional discipline because the mind habitually returns to unresolved questions. Each return reintroduces uncertainty and reopens the decision. You are asked to observe how attention searches for signs, checks progress, and measures distance between present conditions and expected outcomes. In this framework, such checking reinstates the state of not yet. It treats the decision as provisional. Repetition is used not to persuade the mind, but to stabilize its position. The assumed state is revisited until it becomes the default orientation from which attention operates. This is not an attempt to generate belief through force, but to prevent continual reversal. The discipline consists in allowing one conclusion to remain in place without constant renegotiation. The psychological challenge is whether attention can rest without seeking validation. Within Neville's model, causation is ordered psychologically. A state of consciousness is treated as the organizing center from which experience unfolds. You are asked to consider how interpretation already follows expectation. When a conclusion is in place, Perception does not occur neutrally. It is filtered through that conclusion. Neville extends this principle and treats the assumed state not only as interpretive, but as causative in sequence. If consciousness is primary, then the inner decision must come before the outer pattern that later appears as its confirmation. Doubt is understood as reopening the causal loop, while finality closes it. Within this logic, the decision is not an effect of evidence, but the condition under which evidence is later recognized. The coherence of the system depends on maintaining this order. Inner settlement first, sensory alignment second. Neville's framework echoes long-standing patterns in human thought. Philosophical traditions have repeatedly placed inner assent before external certainty. In Stoic philosophy, judgment precedes emotional response. In phenomenology, meaning precedes object recognition. In cognitive psychology, expectation shapes perception. You are asked to recognize the continuity of this structure. The mind does not passively register a world and then decide what it means. It first adopts a position, and the world is encountered through that position. Neville's formulation places this process at the level of assumed causation rather than mere interpretation. By treating inner resolution as primary, he aligns with a recurring model in which certainty arises internally and is later mirrored by experience. The persistence of such models suggests a stable feature of how human cognition relates decision, perception, and the sense of order. In this framework, perception is always conditioned by prior acceptance. What is noticed, what is emphasized, and what is dismissed are organized by the state the mind is already occupying. You are asked to observe how, once a conclusion is reached, information that supports it becomes prominent, while contradictory signals lose urgency. This is not framed as distortion, but as organization. The mind seeks coherence with its settled position. Neville's model treats this selective coherence as part of the mechanism by which experience comes to reflect assumption. Proof does not create belief. Belief determines what will count as proof. Reality, as it is experienced, is filtered through the decision that has already been accepted as final. The unresolved question is whether perception merely reveals coherence or actively participates in constructing it. Agency in this system is located in the choice of inner position rather than in the control of external sequences. To act is to commit to a state, not to manipulate circumstances. You are asked to consider what it means to experience yourself as the author of your psychological orientation. Once a decision is final internally, reactions, interpretations, and expectations follow from that position. The sense of being a cause arises from sustaining this inner commitment. Responsibility is therefore defined as the willingness to remain in a concluded state without constantly transferring authority to external feedback. Proof is understood as a later effect of commitment, not its prerequisite. The tension lies in whether inner authorship alone is sufficient to sustain the feeling of causation. At the end of Neville Goddard's model, the mind settles into a state of cognitive quiet. The sequence can be observed without argument. Inner decision first, perceptual alignment later. You are not asked to accept or reject this structure. You are asked to see its internal order. Consciousness is treated as primary. Assumption is treated as organizing. Finality is treated as the condition that suspends the need for continual verification. In this stillness, there is no instruction and no demand. There is only the clarity of how the model arranges certainty, attention, and experience. The decision is closed inwardly. Perception reorganizes outwardly, and the sense of causation is located in the settled state of mind itself.